Okay, so before we get into the LM side of the ISLM analysis, I want to sort of real quick take stock of some really important things that happened during the IS conversation that you may not have noticed. I kind of like to teach sort of the IS and then kind of come back and say, oh, by the way, did you notice? And one of the things that I'm going to ask that you noticed is like kind of one of the main philosophical differences between classical and Keynesian views of the macroeconomy. So let's think about that for just a second here. Um, if we just go to the whiteboard, this is hold on one second. I gotta sorry, my whiteboard crashed. Let's see if we can get it back. There we go. So what we have here is just the simple derivation of the IS curve. And in particular, the way we think about it is we maybe sort of start with this initial level of planned expenditure. And again, remember, this is planned expenditure equal to actual expenditure. And we just have three different sort of equilibrium points. And again, I didn't necessarily say this much towards the tail end of the video, but we are thinking about this in terms of what we call the goods market. So the IS curve is the goods market clearing. All right. Now, one sort of aspect of Keynesian uh, sort of macroeconomic thinking that is very similar to classical economic thinking is that generally speaking, there is an assumption that there are equilibrium processes undergirding sort of the major dynamic pieces of the macroeconomy. Ultimately, though, one of the sort of ideas that Keynes is really going to stress is that that equilibration process is not always immediate or may not necessarily occur under certain circumstances. And in particular, Keynes is referring to equilibrium in aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Basically, classical economics says that aggregate supply will always equal aggregate demand. And so labor markets clear, loanable funds markets clear, and keep that sort of idea held in truth, sort of the way the classicals would describe it. In the Keynesian sort of framework, the idea is that the goods market and then ultimately the money market, which we're going to describe in a moment, those will always be in equilibrium. However, aggregate supply does not necessarily equal aggregate demand, right? And again, remember, this goes back to this idea of the savings glut that we talked about in the previous video. So now let's look at the Keynesian cross that we use to derive the IS curve, and let's think about one of the most practically important ideas that this sets up. So what's going on here is basically an argument about inventories. In the classical model, inventories either don't exist or they are, in a sense, uncostly to firms. So in other words, if inventories pile up, it's either not a problem or more sort of succinctly, inventories will not pile up, that there always is going to be this market clearing. And so inventories, in a sense, are going to be minimized in the classical model. In the Keynesian model, this is not true at all, because the idea is that if demand is under supply, you're going to have a buildup of inventories. And inventories is just unsold product. And an unsold product, by the way, is not merely unrealized profits, but it is costs. It costs firms money to hold inventory. So they're economically problematic. Firms are always trying to shed inventories. And so the sort of macroeconomic question is, are there reasons for us to suspect that they may not be able to clear those inventories? And the argument that sort of Keynesian side is going to make is yes, that idea of the supply glut is going to come from a buildup of inventories sort of in the aggregate supply space. So then the question is, why would there be this sort of buildup of inventories? Wouldn't firms, in a sense, see that people are not buying their products and therefore stop producing? And the Keynesian argument is no, that basically there's going to be this time period prior to there being this sort of realization of an economic dysfunction in which people will continue to behave assuming things are okay. This sort of goes back in some sense to that animal spirits argument that we talked about. So it's sort of people tend to be maybe optimistic about the economy and until there is reason to no longer be optimistic about it. And we may, of course, ignore pessimistic signs that are coming our direction. So, but the key argument here is that inventories chase expenditures because what's going on if interest rates are falling and we're going in this direction, or interest rates I'm sorry, if interest rates are increasing and we're moving in this direction, or interest rates are falling and we're moving in this direction, whether expenditure is increasing or decreasing, what that induces, according to Keynes, is supply. That basically, in this sort of Keynesian sense, what we have is that, again, not only does demand equal supply and equilibrium, but that demand creates supply. So, excuse me, a key Keynesian idea that is perpendicular to the classical idea is that demand induces supply. And that's a key idea here, because the idea here is that the relative expenditures is going to induce firms to then make product. And when the expenditure is increasing, what that enables is for firms to either have reduced inventories or no longer have inventories. And when that occurs, that causes output to increase. Because in a sense, they're clearing their shelves off and then they're starting to make more product to match this new higher level of expenditure. On the other end, if expenditure declines, then inventories pile up. As inventories pile up, costs pile up, and output decline. So the idea behind the Keynesian cross is not merely that output is going to be a function of expenditure and that expenditure is going to be a function of interest rates, but that, importantly, demand induces supply. That supply exists because demand is there for it. Otherwise, we have this economic dysfunction, and again, we go back to the sort of speculative bubble supply glut that we saw during the Great Depression. So, there's just some really important kind of stuff there that I didn't necessarily name. That I want to make sure that you see, because I think it's for me in economics, it was always really exciting to kind of be surprised. And so, the idea of Say's law and the idea of supply creating demand, like I tell you that we sort of reject that in modern economics, but it still is something that I think makes a lot of sense to people. But then I think also once you sort of entertain the idea that demand creates supply, that also makes sense. And I think speaks to one of the kind of foundational mysteries of economics that we will probably always be grappling with, which is it's a very chicken and egg thing. What comes first, the supply or demand? And I think the unhelpful answer, the imperfect answer that economists have is that we think they arise at the same time, but that the timing is interesting. And depending upon how you think about it, you think supply comes first then demand, or demand then supply. Again, mainstream economics, we tend to think that Keynes was really onto something. And so at the very least, we think that supply is informed by demand, and therefore that supply will move relative to demand. And the big idea this ultimately ends up sort of putting in our heads is that aggregate demand matters. That's going to be the big story here. Prior to Keynes, nobody, it was aggregate supply. That was what mattered in the economy. And it was really the only thing that moved. But now we're going to allow aggregate demand to move, and the argument is going to be almost like the importance gets shifted completely to that end. Okay, so we've built the goods market. We've built the IS curve. Now let's build the LM curve that comes from the money market. So the idea that Keynes really happened upon that is again one of those ideas we really kept with us. And even Milton Friedman, who comes after Keynes and sort of at times disagrees with Keynes on a number of issues, certainly. One of the things that he also agrees with Keynes about is that liquidity is really the sort of driver of interest rates in the money market, basically the extent of liquidity. Whereas Keynes differs from Friedman is that Friedman really emphasizes the money supply, and Keynes really emphasizes money demand. But they end up having a very similar view of money markets. It's very similar to the classical Keynesian dichotomy of emphasizing supply over demand. And that sort of continues on into monetarism. Friedman sort of emphasizes money supply over money demand, whereas Keynes sort of it thinks more in terms of money demand. So anyway, we're going to have a very quantity equation influence setup here. So, that Keynesian analysis carries with it the sort of Fisherian quantity equation idea. So we have a stock of money, what we're going to refer to as real money balances. So M divided by P here is real money balances. And as you'll recall, this is the way that we think about the money supply. That like you have M as the money supply, but then we're going to set that against price level. This was especially important in the classical model because it was really the only place where prices showed up. And you sort of backed in prices into the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model to get that downward sloping aggregate demand. Now, later on, the prices are going to loom large because we're actually going to have a place for them in the model. And what's going to be interesting about that is that that's going to then cause there to be this movement potentially of real money balances that has nothing to do with money supply, but has everything to do with inflation, has everything to do with actual price levels. So that's sort of something to keep in mind. So we have a money supply, and then we have money demand. So this is where Keynes gets this idea of liquidity preference. Money demand here is going to be a function of interest rates, and in particular, a negative function of interest rates. The higher the interest rates, the greater the quantity demand for cash will tend to be, and the higher the interest rates, the lower the quantity demand for cash will be. And the reason why that is because at really high interest rates, you're incentivized to put money into checking deposits, you're incentivized to put money into savings accounts, you're incentivized to not hold cash. Whereas at very low interest rates, there's very little reason to put money into banks, and therefore you're incentivized to hold on to more cash. This is a very important idea in the sort of ISLM analysis, that there is a negative relationship between the willingness to hold money and interest rates. So I think that makes a lot of sense in that sort of simple sort of commercial banking setup, but it does sort of worthwhile to think about that for just a moment. So we have money supply, we have money demand. Those two things are going to equilibrate. Much like the goods market argument, Keynes is going to say that the money market equilibrates, that there is equilibration always in the money market. So if, for example, there's a fall in the money supply, either exogenously or most likely due to some sort of policy, in particular contractionary monetary policy. We've already seen this before. This sort of idea of money supply against money demand relating to interest rates has actually already been a part of our analysis. So this should be very comfortable to you and really should not require that much sort of discussion. So if we just look at the sort of empirical sort of connection between money supply and interest rates, do they tend to move as we expect them to move? And absolutely. So when the money supply tends to go down, we see interest rates tend to go up. And so on and so forth. And in particular, there is this classic example. I've mentioned this in previous videos. We have the so-called Volcker recession. The 81 recession, which is an induced recession. It is the Federal Reserve under Volcker choosing to run really, really high interest rates, to target really high interest rates in an attempt to bring down inflation. And so what the sort of lesson here is that indeed money tightening induces higher interest rates, money loosening tends to induce lower interest rates. And so ultimately, we're going to sort of think about this in a very classic contractionary, expansionary sort of way. Now, the important thing here really ends up being about the sort of differences in, again, market clearing. If you remember in the classical model, we assume like complete market clearing. And so interest rates are moving completely flexibly and equilibrating the economy. In the Keynesian setting, so we're looking right here, we're going to assume sticky prices. And so in particular, the change in investment that comes from, for example, monetary tightening on nominal interest rates is that interest rates are going to go up as a result of monetary tightening. In the classical model, this was not necessarily the case. In the neoclassical sort of influence, that sort of started to kind of be the particular idea. But again, just we want to think that in the Keynesian scenario, we get this sort of rigidity, we get this stickiness, prices, interest rates. They don't immediately change to equilibrate the economy. And that ends up being really important ultimately to policy prescriptions as laid out by the sort of Keynesian view of the economy. So we're going to develop an LM curve in the same way that we developed an IS curve. The LM curve is going to give us all combinations of R and Y that equate the money market. So whatever equilibration occurs in the money market, that's going to produce combinations of interest rate and output in the same way that in the goods market, we got combinations of interest rates and output. The difference is that whereas in the goods market, there is a negative relationship between interest rates and output, in the money market, there is an increasing relationship between interest rates and output. And the reason why that is because when output goes up, when income rises, we expect there to be an increase in the demand for money, right? So because the economy has improved, maybe the economy has made more stuff, incomes are higher, then this puts upward pressure on money demand. And so now we get on the LM side this really interesting relationship, which is higher interest rates are associated with higher levels of output. That is not something that the classical model really sort of got into, right? In the classical model, we tend to think about sort of aggregate demand as having this negative relationship between interest rates and output, which gives us that sort of negative relationship between prices and output. But in the Keynesian sort of sense, what Keynes pointed out was that, but look, you have this other side of the economy, the money market, represented by this LM curve, which illustrates the opposite, that there is a positive relationship between interest rates and output. And so that's how we get the LM curve. So the IS curve is derived from understanding that higher interest rates correspond to lower expenditure, and lower interest rates correspond to higher expenditure. So we get this negative relationship between interest rates and output. And then in the money market, we get the opposite. We get a positive relationship between interest rates and output. And so we can relate the IS curve also to the loanable funds model. So we can think about it not just in terms of money market, but we can also think about it in terms of loanable funds. This is, again, a real sort of key kind of Keynesian idea. One of the things that's going to separate monetarists and sort of post-Keynesians from Keynesians is this idea that you can separate loanable funds from the money market. In the sort of Friedman-esque sort of sense, those two ended up being the same because they put such a heavy emphasis on money supply. The reason that Keynes ends up putting such a heavy emphasis on money demand is because money demand is a function ultimately of the loanable funds market, because there's this interplay between my willingness to hold cash as opposed to sticking it into a bank, and then banks having the liquidity available to them to make out loans. So this is where you get this idea of liquidity preference. And so that consumers have particular liquidity preferences relative to particular interest rates. And in particular, we find that higher interest rates correspond to higher levels of output. Basically, one of the things to take away from this idea is also that in the loanable funds market, economic growth will tend to put upward pressure on interest rates. that ends up being important in a world where we have a Fed who is interested in targeting particular interest rates as opposed to targeting particular money supply. And then this idea being that the sort of equilibrium level of interest rates is not only affected by the money market, but is also affected by the loanable funds market. And that's where you really start to get into some interesting territory with respect to bonds, and you get into yield curve territory. And we'll certainly be talking about that a lot next week. All right, now, again, sort of almost more importantly for us than just the actual derivation is, okay, policy experiments. So, for example, let's say the Fed wants to run contractionary monetary policy. So the Fed wants to have a lower money supply. So what that's going to cause is it's going to cause higher interest rates in the money market. And those higher interest rates in the money market are going to induce an LM curve shift to the left. So we get an upward, basically LM shift backwards. And so now what this implies is that for the same level of output, the economy is now going to be operating at a higher interest rate. Now, the important part here, though, is that this does not happen in isolation, because ultimately there's going to be an IS curve, right? And there's going to be an equilibrium in the ISLM analysis. And so what we're going to get here ultimately is that when you get, for example, a contractionary monetary policy and you get a backward shift of the LM curve, that this is actually going to correlate with a decrease in output ultimately. So in the equilibrium, we have ISLM that equate and then spit out an equilibrium interest rate. We assume this is, by the way, a real interest rate. That ends up being important when we start talking about the Fisher, I'm sorry, not the Fisher effect, the Phillips curve towards the end of this particular week. So again, keep in mind that we are assuming a real interest rate here. And then all that's going on here at equilibrium is we have two sort of simultaneous equilibriums. We have the equilibrium in the goods market, which produces the IS curve, and we have equilibrium in the money markets, which produces the LM curve. So putting this all in the kind of a big picture, this is sort of what it ultimately kind of looks like. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to continue to develop sort of the ISLM analysis, and we're going to ask ourselves, for example, what happens in the ISLM market if the government, increases government spending? Well, if the government increases government spending, so if the change in G is upwards, this is going to induce an IS curve shift. So we go from IS0 to IS1, right? We expect at that higher level of government spending, a new higher level of output, and we also expect there to be upward pressure put on interest rates, okay? Now, that sort of stops the analysis at this point. That's not going to stop our analysis ultimately when we build in aggregate supply, aggregate demand, which we're going to start to layer in just a bit. But for now, we're going to kind of stop it. And we're going to say, okay, if we have expansionary fiscal policy, government spending increases or taxes decreasing, that's going to cause an IS curve shift to the right, higher output and upward pressure being put on interest rates. If, on the other hand, we have expansionary monetary policy, so the change in M is upwards, for example, this is going to cause an LM curve shift in this direction, right? And at that LM curve shift, we get also a higher level of output, but we get downward pressure on interest rates, right? So you get that expansionary monetary policy inducing downward pressure on interest rate, as we would tend to expect. And so this is what you do with ISLM. This is really the beauty of all this, is that we can do all these policy experiments And then what we'll see is that there's a really nice story that can now be put together with aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Interestingly enough, ISLM is where we get our aggregate demand function from. And that's a really key sort of idea here is that when we talk about ISLM shows up in aggregate demand. There's sometimes students get confused because the LM curve looks like a supply curve, and there's a tendency maybe to think that the LM curve shows up on aggregate supply, even though it has nothing to do with aggregate supply. This is the idea is that aggregate demand in your economy is going to come from two places. It's going to come from the goods market, IS curve, and it's going to come from the money market, the LM curve. That was one of Keynes' key contributions. Now, it's important to point out Keynes never drew an ISLM curve. That was developed after Keynes. It was sort of like Einstein, right, where he comes up with a bunch of ideas. We work out the math years later and find out he was correct. The ISLM analysis was sort of developed by people who came after Keynes, but in a way, found out, well, okay, actually, this makes a lot of sense. There was a real triumph of ISLM. It did a great job of explaining the Great Depression. It did a great job of explaining the post-World War II boom period. It really solidified itself as like the main sort of theoretical underpinning. But like I said, we're going to sort of move on to aggregate supply, aggregate demand, and then kind of the idea is going to be to sort of have this Keynesian sort of consensus as to, in particular, what should government do in response to a recessionary period.